Chantal is a design manager in Autodesk's construction organization through the PlanGrid acquisition. She spends her time thinking about how to grow and support healthy team cultures and loves tricky, systematic challenges. Cody is a design leader for the field collaboration products in Autodesk Construction Solutions, focused on building a better experience for construction workers on the job site. Very excited to have you both here.
Let's welcome Chantal and Cody. And I have the music plugged in. Yay.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, everyone. We're super excited to be here. And this is the first time we've done this talk for a group outside of Autodesk. So this will be a fun challenge, and especially doing it remote. So what is assumption tracking? We talked about it a little bit, but it's, as we all know, product development isn't really a straightforward process. Every day, there's new decisions to make, new questions to answer, and making it to the finish line, everyone needs to be on the same page. This is extra hard, as I'm sure some of us are already finding when we are doing it in a remote capacity, especially when you're not used to working in that way. So this methodology, if you've read the book Lean UX, it's talked a lot about in there. So we did not come up with this, Lean UX came up with this, but we've kind of like taken the process and evolved it a little bit to work it for our teams. So what is assumption tracking? It's a method of moving really fast and moving smart that helps you answer questions like, should we pursue this market? Have we done enough research? Do we understand the problem we're trying to solve? What should the MVP be? Are we ready to launch? What technologies should we use? Is the team on the same page? Why are we doing what we're doing? And what should we do next? And a whole bunch of other stuff. It's very flexible. Things that we've used this methodology in, like stakeholder management, like we mentioned, doing communications, just sharing knowledge and onboarding new teammates. We've used this to, when we had new interns join and they were ramping up on a project, doing assumption tracking was a really helpful and productive way to get them on the same page and make it a little bit more interactive, developing new products and also evaluating career paths. If you're thinking about, man, should I become a product designer? Should I become a product manager? You can use assumption tracking to help you kind of like weigh the different pros, cons, and options there. So before we dive into all that, though, just a little bit about us. So hello, I'm Chantal, design manager at Autodesk. So I am based in SF, but originally from Canada. And the way I've been handling all the COVID fun and adventures is by doing a lot of cooking and also by trying to enjoy the nature and beautiful weather here in San Francisco.
And I'm Cody. I'm a design manager at Autodesk. Came in through PlanGrid as well. I am based in New York, which is fun right now. I've also been doing a lot of cooking. It's been fun.
So as we mentioned, we both came in through the PlanGrid acquisition where we were design managers, and now we work at Autodesk, our big parent company. And so you might have been like, Auto what? PlanGrid? Who's that? So what we do, for a little context, is we're part of the construction industry. So we build software that helps construction workers do what they do more efficiently, safer, all that good stuff. And so while you might not have heard of us, you've definitely probably seen or potentially even been in some of the projects that we've been involved in. If you're in the Canadian, and if you're in Canada, Conestoga College has used us to work on their new campus. If you know of Stanford also uses us on their campus. SF MoMA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, used us for their new extension. And various tech companies that are unnamed have also used us in their new spaceship-shaped buildings. And also, gotta say this always, we are hiring. So if you're interested in construction or interested in some of these methodologies, you're like, man, I want to work somewhere that uses this kind of stuff, definitely check us out. You can check out the PlanGrid Careers website, which is more specific to construction. And then you can also check out Autodesk Careers, which has like all the careers across all of Autodesk. The Toronto office, for example, focuses a lot on generative design, which is like super cool, crazy stuff. So definitely check out those. So enough about us. We will now get into this. So assumption tracking, how does this cool methodology thing work? One, it's drafting assumptions that relate most to the most pressing questions. Two, you rank them by risk and confidence. Three, you validate or invalidate the assumptions that are high risk and low confidence. And then you just rinse and repeat until all the most important stuff is answered and you've built an amazing product. Okay, cool. That was our talk. Thank you all for coming. I hope you learned a lot. Just kidding. It is that simple, but it is a little bit more elaborate, and some of the steps have a little bit more involved than what we might have shown there. So we will dive into it. And just as a heads up, this is, it will be an interactive workshop. So there will be parts where we'll be asking you to use Google Sheets for a couple things. So if you're not on a computer right now, definitely hop on one because you'll need it to work on the session. And now I will pass it over to Cody to do a quick case study on PlanGrid. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then Cody is going to share his screen.
Cool. Yeah, so just want to go through an example of how we use this process at PlanGrid to build a new product. So the case study is about a product called submittals. So submittals are a unique thing in the construction industry. It's sort of Baroque and Byzantine, and you don't need to understand too much of it. It's an approval process. There's two things you need to know. One, everyone hates them. There are thousands of these on decent sized construction project, and you're tracking documents coming through email, and they're almost always just in an Excel spreadsheet, which is manually updated. Things get lost. It's the worst. It takes a huge amount of time, especially at the beginning of the project. The other thing is that they're very important. If you don't build the building correctly and you don't build it out of the right things, bad things can happen. Structural failures being sort of the notable one. There's a case study on Wikipedia about a hotel where they changed the way one bolt was installed and an entire walkway collapsed. So it's critical to get it right. So we had a lot of constraints in this process, and you're all familiar with the standard, loop of product development where you have an idea, you validate the idea, you build it, you launch it, you learn from it, you iterate. We didn't have time for that for this specific project. So we needed a way to kind of jump to the end and start learning quickly. The problem was that because this process is so critical, dummy data and prototypes weren't always appropriate. They didn't resonate with people. They didn't have the same impact. So we did the assumption tracking process. We had done some research. We knew some of the pain points, and we ranked our assumptions that we had out of that. And then we looked at each of these and figured out how can we test these. Some of them we could test in traditional ways, surveys. Some of them we could test with things like clickable prototypes, basic interaction models, things like that. And then we were left with this sort of critical one, the highest risk, the lowest confidence, which was, can we actually replace the existing common spreadsheet email process? So we came up with a way to do this. And if any of you are familiar with Futurama and you know how Bender refers to humans, we came up with Project Meatbag. So the idea here was that we were sort of the machinery. We would act as if we'd built the product, but instead of having any of the code running, it would just be people on the team entering the data. We would do the manual process that the customers would normally do, and we would see if the level of interaction they had was enough. So we sent an email to some customers and said, hey, we have a great new tool. All you need to do is forward us that data you'd normally be manually entering, and then it will magically populate and we'll send you a report. Of course, this was just the team. This was the entire team, product, research, engineering. And this is the tool we actually built. It was a Google spreadsheet with a fairly significant amount of automation and formatting, but fundamentally, we were doing what they would have been doing and just sort of automating it as we went. We generated a dashboard in the tool, and this is where it started to get very interesting because most of them had never seen their data like this. They were entering data in the spreadsheet, but it wasn't in a formatted way. They couldn't really run queries on it. And so we leapt way ahead in terms of like utility with this. We use that to power that weekly report that we talked about. And as we went through this process, we constantly went back to the assumption tracking process and, things like, do we have the right columns? Do we have the right graphs? And we ended up tracking 600 of these things across 5 projects over a 4-month time period, including this $500 million highway interchange in California. So it was real data with real consequences, and it worked. And the tool and the iterative use of this tool was really what powered it and sort of told us what we should be trying next, what we should be validating next. And as we sort of walked through these things, we ended up with the surprise bonus product. So as we sort of validated the top things, we got down to the middle and we were like, well, do we need to create this register in the first place, this big spreadsheet of stuff, or can we just have them do that and then do all the tracking? Now, creating this thing's a nightmare. These are 1,000-page documents, and we were looking at it. We're like, well, I mean, there's a structure to this, and we kind of have a system for dealing with structured data now. So we did the same thing again. We sent people an email that said, hey, we're going to extract your submittals for you. Just send us that spec document and we'll send you back the spreadsheet. We got a little smarter this time. We hired data entry contractors. The first time was painful enough. And it worked. We wrote a script for the data contractors, which allowed us to then write the algorithm that did this automatically. And the first time we showed this to people working, people were literally in tears because we were taking weeks of their time and turning it into a 30-second or 1-minute long process. So we not only validated the product we wanted to build originally, but we found a new opportunity by going through the assumptions we had and testing and validating them. There was a fun little thing where we were featured in the most interesting advances in construction technology, along with this robot stacking drywall. The robot, obviously, a very advanced piece of tech doing something pretty simple. And we used a pretty simple piece of tech to do something pretty advanced, which was satisfying. And with that, I will hand it back off to Chantal.
Awesome. Thanks, Cody. Every time I hear that story, I get so happy. I love that story so much. So now we're going to talk about how you can replicate the really positive results that the submittals team at PlanGrid had on your own teams. So we're going to walk through the steps in a little bit more detail. But the first step, step 0, is to assess your project and your goals. There's no methodology that solves all things, that does all things for all people. So if you're thinking about, assumption tracking, I should try that. You should really think critically about what problems are you trying to solve with this tool, and then assess is this the right tool for the job? It does a lot of things. It's very, very flexible, but just be aware of what you are actually looking to do, because it's not a miracle band-aid to all things and all problems. And it's also really important, and I'm going to harp on this a few times and be really annoying, but how are you going to build it into your process? The most important thing to take away is that assumption tracking is not a one and done thing. Like Cody was saying, they made the initial spreadsheet and then they referred to it as they went through the process to tell them what the next steps were. What do they need to validate yet? Are they ready to launch? Are they ready to incorporate real data? So if you're going to use this tool, it needs to be part of your process and not just a thing you kind of slap on at random points. Very, very critical. So the first step, which will make sense, is drafting your assumptions. So something to keep in mind when drafting assumptions is that the scale and nature of your assumptions will depend where you are in the project. So there's lots of different ways people articulate the kind of product development workflow. There's learn, build, iterate, and then there's discover, define, ideate, or there are lots of different ways of framing it. So however your company frames it. On the design team, we often use discover, define, ideate, build, document, or something like that. So that's sort of the verbiage I'll be using here. But depending on where you are in the process, you're going to need a different granularity. So the kind of assumptions you're assessing at Discover are going to be a lot more broad and a lot more around the target area, the market, that kind of thing. Whereas the stuff you're looking at Ideate is going to be a lot more on the UI side. So to give you some examples, so let's say we're in the Discover phase and we try and draft an assumption, and we draft out, we need a generate invoice button. Now I'd say this is probably not the best kind of assumption that you should be doing at Discover. It's really solution focused, whereas at Discover, you need to be thinking a lot more broadly about the solution space. Maybe you'll draft out, well, okay, fine. Users need a way to generate invoices. That's a lot less UI. Still a little too solution specific. It's really assuming that this is the right way to do something. And that's more of when you get to the Ideate. So what we would recommend is something a little bit more like a major pain point for small business owners is generating invoices. And the reason we recommend this kind of framing is one, it stays completely away from solution and really just focuses on pain points. And two, it also focuses on a specific target user. So small business owners. So as opposed to something very, very broad like users. Something to note about the PlanGrid example of submittals is the submittals team was very, very thoughtful about what kind of customers they targeted for their first version. They didn't just target all construction of all kinds. They found a subset of users, people who are using spreadsheets and emails, and really focused on them for their initial testing. This really helped them validate assumptions quickly and without having to have huge research panels. So we recommend, if you're doing in the Discover kind of phase, like having a very targeted kind of group that you're looking at. Yes, so this is the right one. So in addition to the scale of nature, making it is also very important to phrase assumptions in a way that makes the criteria for validation or invalidation really clear. And oftentimes, if not almost all the time, this means having objectively observable behavior built into your assumption. Sometimes this is really hard to do. So it is definitely like a process. You're going to need to iterate. You're going to need to like critique each other's assumptions. But the way that we think about it is like, okay, let's say we're in the Ideate phase now. So we're getting a little bit more solution-y than we were before. We could say that our target user is a Minnesotan pastry chef. So this wouldn't be a great kind of assumption for the Ideate phase, because this is a lot more focused on target user, which, gosh, I really hope you figured out back in the Discover phase. If you haven't figured out your target user yet, you might want to hop back a couple steps. You probably shouldn't be thinking about your solution yet. Maybe you can do like users will like tables better than a card view. This one is in the right phase. It is a UI-focused one in a Ideate kind of place. However, thinking back to the objectively observable, will like isn't the most observable thing. The only way you can really gauge that is like, do you like this? And that's not typically a really good research methodology. So it's a little bit more subjective. So something that you might do instead is it's important to let bakers perform bulk actions on their pastry inventory. And the reason this is a little bit better, it doesn't have necessarily something key built into it, like we will see bakers performing big bulk actions, but what it does have is a sense of like understanding the baker's workflows and then using that to inform, should it be a table versus a card or something like that. So a couple traps. So we talked a little bit about this already, but a really common thing is to get too solution-y when you're in the discovery phase. Sometimes when we're doing assumption tracking, people will come up with just like brain dump, just like literally everything they're thinking about their new product or new business. So for example, if you're thinking about creating a new business and you're using assumption tracking, sometimes people will be like, my assumption is that the brand should be blue and that the name should be this and they haven't even figured out the business model yet, and they're already doing assumptions on the naming and the brand and the look and feel. So I think like taking a step back and making sure that your assumptions are focused on the right phase. And on that note, having too many assumptions, if you have like over 100 assumptions, it might be worth like assessing like, are these all in the appropriate phase? Is there any we can cull? You'll often have a lot that you kind of like look at and other ones you don't look at as much. So it's okay if you have like a decent chunk, but having too many sometimes results in people trying to manage them in various ways, like nesting assumptions, and it just makes the whole thing a little bit more crazy. And going back to it, not having assumptions that are specific enough to validate makes it really hard to base decisions off of your assumption tracking, and makes it hard to do the next step. So taking that time to iterate and reflect on assumptions before going out in the world, I think is really, really helpful. Sometimes, especially your first time doing this, it can take a really long time. I've definitely had hour to 2 hour, just like sometimes 3 hour long meetings on just like drafting the assumptions. And it can feel like, why are we doing this? This seems like a waste of time. But then you realize the benefits later, especially after the discussions you have as you're iterating. So we're going to try this. This is where the interactive part comes in. But before we dive into it, any questions? We can answer a couple of those. And I think the hosts are going to take those from the swap card app, paste them into our Zoom, and then we'll answer some. So maybe do a couple minutes.
One question is, how do we communicate to our team or stakeholders to not get too solution-y during these brainstorming sessions?
Cody, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so a lot of that is just sort of like setting the stage for the entire process. If you like, it goes back to sort of like good meeting hygiene. It's like, what's the agenda of this meeting? We're here to like only come up with questions. We're here to only come up with like things that meet this format. Sometimes you might have to get a little bit rigid and have an actual like structure. Like, we are only going to write sentences that meet as a blank, you know what I mean? Like a jobs to be done sort of style, depending on how rowdy your crew is.
Yeah, I would add on to that too. If you have a particular stakeholder that is like particularly hard to manage, or you're having a hard time having them kind of focus, something that I've done before is like, okay, great feedback, thank you so much. We're not quite at that stage yet, but let's make another tab in this assumption spreadsheet, and we'll name it ideate, and we'll put your assumptions there. And when we get to that stage, that's when we're there. So sometimes just like seeing you write down their thoughts and like put it somewhere is enough to assure the person that like their feedback is appreciated, they're useful, they're contributing, but just later.
That's one more question. What does not too solution-y look like when you're working on a particular feature or function rather than an entire product?
At least from my stance, and Cody add on, like, even if you are building in a smaller area, you still have assumptions around pain points, values, that sort of thing. So that it might be a smaller scale, but unless you're actually in the ideating, like we are building solutions right now phase, your research phase still should have a focus on understanding the underlying needs and less on the actual implementation of those needs. Cody, do you want to add on?
I think that's good. A couple more questions. One is, what's the difference between an assumption and a hypothesis? Which it's a good question. It's a semantic difference that may not be particularly meaningful. Assumptions it's basically a way to frame your hypotheses in terms of like failure. So hypothesis is someone will find value in X, and the assumption is like X has value, and if you're wrong about the assumption, then like your product is going to be a failure. So it's really just like it's the same thing. It's just like how you want to frame it. And then
maybe one last question, then we'll move on.
Yeah, one last question I think is useful is, can you clarify risk versus confidence?
Oh, we will get into that and later in the section, but for a high level, risk is like, how screwed are we if we get this wrong? And confidence is like, how sure are we that this is correct?
And let's move on now, but I would say if you still have questions when we're done, you can reach out to us on the Remote Design Week Slack as well.
Yeah, and we've also put our Twitter handles down in the right-hand corner. I am a little more active than Cody, but you can tweet at both of us and we will both end up seeing it at some point. Oops. All right. Okay. So at this point, I think the moderators are going to post a URL in the swap chat, and then also you can go here. You can type it in if you need to. I won't be able to see the spreadsheet right now because I'm sharing my screen, but I think Cody is able to see it, and so he'll look. So there's going to be a spreadsheet with some instructions on the top, and there's going to be like a little table situation. In that table, there's a little, if you look below it, there should be a little like sheet name that says duplicate me. So you should be able to duplicate it, put your name, put a nickname, whatever it is, just to like mark it as your space. And that's going to be somewhere where you're going to be able to do the activity. So I'll give people like a few seconds to do that. Okay, I'm gonna, Cody, how's it looking? Are we good to move?
Yep.
Cool, all right, awesome. So welcome everyone. We're gonna start a business together. So inspired by the toilet paper shortages that have plagued us all in this dark time, you've come to the amazing idea that you're going to start a bidet company in North America. So you're in the discover phase. This is kind of a fresh idea that just kind of came to you in a lightning bolt strike of inspiration. But because you're also a very practical person as well as an inspiring, thoughtful leader, you want to really invalidate your assumptions before you hire a bunch of people, invest your life savings, and really get this company going. So some example assumptions that you might have at this stage is like, you might assume that North Americans are familiar or unfamiliar with the concept of a bidet. Depending on your background, you might have different assumptions. You might assume that there's a sizable market of people interested in having a bidet who can install them. Maybe some people are renters and are unable to make those changes. So you need to make sure that there's a sizable market for this amazing thing that you're going to sell. You also might have some assumptions around what customers value. So you might have the assumption that the hygienic benefits of bidets are going to be more important to customers than saving money. So maybe that'll lead you to charge more for it and get a better sense of how viable this business is. So these are just examples. These are not ones you have to write or anything like that, but just to get you a sense of the kind of thing we're looking for. So inspired by these, you're going to start the bidet company. So I'll give you maybe like 5 minutes to draft some assumptions and consider the market fit, potential customer pain points and problems to be solved, potential constraints and pitfalls, and we'll give you a few minutes to do that.
And I think we have fully overloaded Google Docs. So just as a very quick, all you really need for this is a note app or piece of paper, or really anywhere to write stuff down. And you'll just be writing down a list of the things, your assumptions, so like sentences, and then later on we'll do a risk and a confidence assessment. So like columns where you can put numbers or just some way to track those two numbers.
I was muted while talking. Yeah, you can just open up Google Sheets on your own, and just props to everyone for breaking Google Docs. That's an accomplishment we should all be proud of.
Let me just quickly share the sheet so everyone can see what it looks like. It's very simple, but just in case.
All right. So those are our discovery ones. Don't worry if you only got a couple, that's perfectly fine. This is just for practice in any case. So now we're going to move on to the ideate phase. And let's say you've validated all your assumptions and it turns out this is a great business. You're launching soon, maybe launching your V2 of your product. So now you've decided that, you know what, based on your research, this bidet really needs a companion app. So the research has told you that, so who are you to argue? So you're going to build a companion app for this bidet. So we're going to think about what assumptions would we validate in this ideate stage for this companion app that we're building. So again, some examples you might have are maybe you're interested in the different kinds of displays. So maybe what kind of interface is best for water consumption over time of this bidet. You might have some concerns around what platforms to launch in. So that you have an assumption that launching for Android and iOS is sufficient, and sorry, Windows Surface users, not going to happen for you. And maybe you have an assumption about prioritization. So daily usage tracking should be released as part of the MVP. You think that's like the most important feature, and you think that that's worth really prioritizing. So now take maybe 3 minutes and do some ideation based on this. So think about UI considerations. What kind of stuff would you include in a bidet companion app? The vision, where do you think the product should go? And then scoping and prioritization, where do you think you should start? And maybe any technical considerations or constraints. So Bluetooth could be one. Yeah, lots of different things. So we'll do 3 minutes on this one and draft those assumptions in the same kind of format you were doing before. Okay, awesome. Finish up any last thoughts that you had. Don't worry if you only got a couple, or if you wrote 30, that's awesome too. Onward we go. So we'll maybe do 1 or 2 questions before we move on. Did any questions come up as you were drafting, or things that you realized you had a question around?
So what if individuals on your team have different assumptions? Do you write them all down even though they might contradict each other? That never happens. Everyone always says no. Yeah, that's every time. So what you want to try to do there is like if there's a way to state, like basically find the common ground if you can. You know, there are 3 or 4 assumptions that are similar enough. Can we boil them down? If they're different, you put them in the list, and then like you do the ranking, and that's how you sort of bubble up what's most critical. You do have to sort of gut check, like, do we have 100 in here, or is that too many? So there's some art to it.
Yeah, that's definitely one option. And you can also, depending on the group and like the relationship between the different people and how much trust is built with the team, I think you can also just say, hey, I hear you. Are you okay if we frame this in a positive way instead of a negative way, or something like that? If you two have like, I assume that X is blue and they assume X is green, you could say, hey, for the purpose of this, can we disagree and commit and try red? Because either way, like the purpose is like, this is important to us and this is a thing. So whether the assumption is positive or negative or contradictory doesn't matter too much. It's just making sure that we're all agreed that this is something we should look into.
And then the last question for this section, do you see this as replacing or complementing traditional workshop processes such as discovery workshops, co-creation? Very much a complement. This can be a process that you do after that. Like those are excellent like generative tools, and this can be like a great analysis tool in conjunction.
Yeah, for sure. This can also be used as a to help feed into, like if you're doing a bunch of assumptions about the ideate phase, you can use those for a sketching session or something like that too. Cool. Okay, I'm going to move onward. So now we're going to talk about risk, and we started talking about that a little bit. So the way we like to talk about risk is how screwed are we if we mess this up? And like screwedness can be defined in like a couple of ways. Maybe it's a huge push to do this, like it's going to be months and months of work. So we really don't want to commit that work unless we really know it's going to happen. Or maybe it's just hard to reverse. So something like changing a button color, super easy to do. You can do it in a minute. That's not a really high risk assumption. What is high risk is like maybe entering a new market or something like that. And then confidence is how much proof do we have that this is true? And the real emphasis here is on proof. You need evidence to have confidence. That may sound explanatory, but we'll dig into it a little bit. So the way that we do the rankings and assumption by risk is traditionally it's a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being high, 1 being low. So one of the best ways to do ranking is to do it in a group setting. So this can be physically in a room when there's not a pandemic happening, or it can be remote. And it works just as well in both cases. So as you're trying to do the ranking, and there's a few different ways to do this we'll talk about, it's just even hearing the discussion, like on the questions as well, what do you do when people disagree? That's awesome. It facilitates discussion debate, and you might realize that there's stuff that you thought you were on the same page about that you're actually been miscommunicating about the whole time. And really getting into the details of what the assumption says will help you refine and focus, like just understand where everyone is at. And yeah, as mentioned, very easy to do remote, which is great. So the way we kind of like break this down, I'm talking about the 1 to 5, is confidence. How much proof is it how much proof do we have that this is true? So 5 means we are absolutely certain this is the case. Like perhaps you've done a research sprint on this and you've come out of that sprint with multiple data points that all point to the very similar conclusion. That's a good case to have a nice solid 5 on there. However, 1 means we really have no idea if this is true. For example, me and Cody have worked in the construction space for a little while. I could not tell you if construction workers prefer, generally speaking, Scrabble over Monopoly. I have no context in that, so that would be a real one for me. And the risk side, how screwed are we if we mess this up? So 5 means we will have severely messed this up as wrong, and it'll be hard to fix. So like I mentioned, like entering a new market is a great example of that, or just something that's going to take a lot of resources, a lot of time. And the scale of what this riskiness means, to someone else's question around like, well, what if I'm not releasing a new product? This can kind of fit in, depending on the scale of what you're working on, assess scale of risk accordingly. Otherwise, you're going to end up potentially doing a process where it's like all one risk or something like that. And 1 means this doesn't really matter that much to meeting our goals, or if we get this wrong, it's easy to change. So like button color is a good example, something that just, you can change that really easily. Or like if this isn't quite right, like the product's not going to die, like it's not going to suffer too much. That would be a 1 risk. So some traps to look out for. When debating in a group, go with the lowest confidence and the highest risk. If a bunch of people have different impressions, sometimes people try and average to be kind of equitable to everyone. Averaging just results in everything being like a risk of 3 and a confidence of 3. And then you're like, well, now what do we do? So going with the person who is the most low confidence, or the person who sees the highest risk, is a good way to just like push against your own group's biases and also fight against hive mind. And also don't mistake having the assumption for having confidence. So sometimes people just like feel like they have a good feel for it, or, you know, they've been in this industry for a while, they don't really need to check. Making sure that you actually have data points to point to, and not just like a feeling that you have, is super important. So as a guideline, if you can't point to specific source of knowledge, don't consider it validated. So examples of specific source of knowledge include clear trends in customer interviews that multiple members of the team are a part of. It's important to have multiple members a part of these interviews, because if it's just one person, there's no other data points to like other people have to kind of go against that. Because even sitting in an interview, sometimes you can hear someone say, oh, my interpretation of that person's comment was X, and other person's can be Y. So having multiple people in the interview is really helpful, again, to fight against hive mind, and also just to fight against our own biases. Using metrics and usage data, and also having technical prototypes or tech deep dives, really useful ways of gaining data points. We're going to do one quick question here, and then we're going to give some ranking a try.
Not seeing anything come through yet. Again, you can ping us on Slack if you still have questions after we're done with this.
Oh, we have one quick question. What if people can't agree on what a 1 or a 5 means? Cody, do you want to take that?
That's a good question. I mean, it feels like you, whatever you're doing, the project you're doing, the product you're building, the decision you're making, like the stakes should be clear, I think, probably before you get to this point. So it's like, what's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? It feels like that is a question for like the problem statement phase, or the, you know, solution problem space phase. But yeah, that's one of those things where like you might just have to write down what a 1 means and what a 5 means.
Agreed. Cool. All right, so back to the spreadsheet, or whatever spreadsheet you're using, because we broke the internet. So you might have a risk column and a confidence column, and just take a quick stab at like, pretend you are really going to invest in this company, or pretend you're really going to make this app. Like, what would you say, based on your true feelings, what your risk and confidence is? So I think we'll just leave it on. Oops, here, actually, I'll go here. So for examples, like North Americans are aware of what bidets are. Like, this is probably a big risk, because I would need to do a lot of education and like assign a marketing budget if this is not true. So I have very low confidence. I'm not too sure what people's bidet knowledge is. Our MVP bidet should only come in white. Maybe this is more of an ideate one, but, you know, for example, maybe like a 2 risk, a pretty high confidence. I think a lot of people have white toilets. And bidets are just as hygienic, if not more so, than toilet paper. I've seen a lot of studies on this. So I'm a 5 confidence, and, you know, I'm a 5 risk. People probably aren't into non-hygienic things, but because I know so much about this, I'm not too concerned about the risk, for example. So Now, take a quick moment to rate your assumptions by risk and confidence. Here's the chart just for a reference. And we will give people maybe 1 or 2 minutes to do this, and then we'll finish up. About 30 more seconds here. Hopefully you're pretty close to having just rough ranking, doesn't have to be perfect. All right, we're gonna speed on through. We're about at time. So assumption ranking as a remote group. This we just did it on ourselves, but you can also do this as a group setting. So for example, here's like a quick spreadsheet we just kind of whipped up around like, I don't know, someone's making a design system or something. So for example, you can use your Google spreadsheet and add like a section for each person to put in their rankings, and then sort of look across and get a sense of where do we agree, where do we disagree. And that'll give you a good, an easy way to just to track what are people feeling and then have a conversation. And you can kind of then transfer that to a kind of like shared understanding risk, if that makes sense. So for example, on the last one there, as a designer, I want to contribute ideas quickly and easily. I was a 5 risk. So we would probably go with a 5 and a 1 confidence. And so that's probably what the we would use as the kind of like team shared confidence tracker, confidence risk status. So the next step is to validate and invalidate. So you're probably going to have a bunch of assumptions now, and you're like, gosh, which one of these do I focus on? I've only got so much time and money. And so this was also came up in Cody's talk through in the submittals. Like they had a very small team and they had to move fast, super key, important business to get this product up and going. So you build your research plan around the assumptions that are the highest risk with the lowest confidence. If it's low risk, who cares if you mess it up? It's not going to break anything. And if it's high risk, you definitely want to focus on that. For low confidence stuff, that should be the focus. If you're already high confidence on something, you don't need to reinvent. You don't need to re-dig up all that. If you really are truly high confidence, you have data points on this already, great. Just focus on the stuff that's actually going to make or break the product, the feature, whatever it is that you're doing. So we're not going to talk too deeply about how to do the invalidation stage. Cody talked a little bit about it. And honestly, a researcher or someone with a research background can probably give a whole talk on this alone. So I'm just going to like whiz on through. But when doing interviews, it's best to have multiple questions that target the same assumption so that you can triangulate the data and also just make sure that it isn't your phrasing that's causing a certain thing to come out. And it's better to ask about recent examples, like when is the last time you did X, as opposed to generally like tell us about your experience with X. Just to target specific behaviors. And it's also very helpful to have qualitative and quantitative data around the same assumption, again, for triangulation. And making sure, so some traps really quickly, make sure not to just use metrics to validate assumptions, because metrics are going to tell you, give you a signal, and they're going to tell you the what, but they're not going to tell you the why. And the why is really important to building holistic understanding of what your user needs. And just always remember correlation, not causation. So getting that qualitative understanding of what those numbers mean is super important. Basic some research stuff. Don't ask leading questions like, do you like this? Would you like this in a table or list view? Isn't this better than a spreadsheet? This will invalidate your assumptions, but probably not in a way that is useful to you and your process. And also don't ask questions that ask users to predict their behavior, like, would you pay for this? Would your field team use this? It's probably better to actually talk to those people and build tests that help you actually see the behavior, like in the submittals example, actually giving people a product to use and seeing their behavior there, as opposed to showing them like a mock-up of a product and being like, would you use this? Because you're not going to get the risk, the truly rich results that way. And also making sure that you validate your engineering assumptions. The sooner you look at code when estimating, the better. So making sure that you're also checking assumptions around how much work is this going to be and what is possible. So getting people to touch the actual code that they're going to be affecting and make sure they are knowledgeable about it, or making sure they're knowledgeable about the technology that they're going to be using. And having assumptions around that is also going to make sure that you don't hit snags along the way or have to de-scope later on. So also, the final trap is not basing your research strategy on your assumption tracker. Sometimes people do this whole thing, they spend hours doing assumption tracking, and they come up with a research script that is completely unrelated. So make sure that those two are synergetically related together is very important for actually having success with assumption tracking. And the final step, I told you I'd say it a few times, bring this into your process. Track your assumptions every week. Cody and I worked on a project at one point that wasn't submittal, something else, where every weekly meeting, we would look at our assumption tracker and say, what did we learn this week? What does that mean for assumptions, confidence, and risk? And what does that mean we should focus on this week? Every single week. Like, that is a perfect cadence to do this. If you can't do this every week, it's great for kickoff meetings. It's great for stand-ups. It's great for basing your research plan on MVP discussions, the whole gamut. There's lots of different ways and different cadences of checking in that can be really useful. And that's assumption tracking. Really fast summary. Step 1, draft the assumptions that relate most to the most pressing questions. Step 2, rank them by risk and confidence. And 3, validate and validate only the assumptions that are high risk with low confidence to keep yourself moving fast. And just keep doing that until you have an awesome product. Remember, it can be messy and uncomfortable. It can be really hard to draft assumptions, but don't expect to nail it on the first time. Plan to iterate, revise, and get more comfortable as you go through. So that's a wrap. Thank you so much. For Cody and Chantal from Autodesk, casual reminder that we are hiring. And then questions, feedback, jokes if we have time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chantal. That was really amazing. And beyond the content, which of course everyone loved, really appreciated the structure of your interactive talk. I loved how you spaced out, had time for questions. Designed the whole experience really well. That was amazing. Thank you for that.
Thanks for having us.